I still remember that morning like it's etched into my bones. The sunlight was soft, falling through the blinds in slanted stripes across the kitchen floor. I had my coffee in hand, the steam rising slowly, warm against my fingers. I thought it was just going to be another routine day, just another Monday. But it wasn't. The phone rang, and I almost didn't want to answer it. There was this little voice in my head, call it instinct, call it dread, but I knew something was off. When I saw the caller ID, I felt a tightness in my chest, a squeeze that made my lungs ache. It was the doctor. I answered, trying to make my voice sound casual, normal, but it came out shaky. Hello? Yes, this is me. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. I remember nodding, even though they couldn't see me, like it would somehow convince myself that I could handle whatever was coming. And then, just like that, the words hit me. You have cancer. I don't even know if I gasped or if I just froze. My coffee cup slipped from my fingers, clattering softly against the counter. The bitter liquid spilled over the countertop, and for a second, I didn't even notice. My mind was spinning, repeating the words over and over. Cancer, 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 why me? I asked myself that 1,000 times in those first few moments. I tried to imagine what it would mean, what my life would look like, but everything felt unreal. Like I was watching someone else's life, some movie I couldn't pause or rewind. I flashed back to the waiting room that morning. The smell of antiseptic was strong, almost burning, and I remember the sterile scent sticking to my clothes, to my hair, even to my skin. The chairs were too hard, the lights too bright, and the soft hum of fluorescent bulbs made a kind of unbearable silence. I clutched the armrest like it could ground me, like it could stop my brain from unraveling. That I remember tasting something metallic in my mouth, that coppery edge that always shows up when your stomach drops, so hard you feel it in your teeth. I wanted to spit it out, but I couldn't. I just sat there, frozen, while the receptionist called my name like it was nothing. I walked down the quiet corridor, my shoes echoing against the tile. I remember each step like it was a drumbeat in slow motion. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle to the doctor's office, the cold steel biting my palm. I thought about the life I had, my routines, my plans, the people I loved, and suddenly all of it felt fragile, suspended in this strange, horrifying bubble. When the doctor finally spoke, explaining what it all meant, I tried to take it in. But the words felt distant, like they were underwater, muffled. I nodded when I was supposed to nod, smiled when I was supposed to smile. But inside, it was chaos. My thoughts were scattered. Will I survive? How will my family take this? My job, my life, everything. I wanted to scream, to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped in the reality of my own body, my own mortality. And yet, somewhere in the back of my mind, there was a flicker of defiance, a whisper that said, I'll get through this. Somehow, I'll get through this. But at that moment, that flicker was tiny, almost invisible. I left the clinic that day feeling hollow, like someone had drained all the color from the world. The sky was blue, the trees were swaying, and the city carried on as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Everything inside me had changed. The first day back at work after my diagnosis felt like stepping into someone else's life. I walked into the office, or rather, I trudged in like a ghost wearing my own skin. People greeted me, smiled, asked how I was, and I forced myself to say, I'm fine. Fine. The word tasted bitter in my mouth, like chewing on coffee grounds. Because I wasn't fine. Not even close. Chemo was still fresh in my memory, and the fatigue clung to me like a second layer of skin. Every joint ached, every nerve felt raw. But I sat at my desk anyway, opened my laptop, answered emails, tried to act normal, tried to convince everyone, including myself, that I was still the same person who had been excelling at work before all of this. That I remember staring at the screen, blinking at the blinking cursor, and thinking, I'm doing everything I can. How can they not see that? But inside, I knew it wasn't just about what others saw. I was fighting this war with my own body every single day, and no one could witness that struggle. There were mornings I dragged myself out of bed, clinging to the edge of consciousness. I would sip coffee that tasted like ash, hoping the warmth would trick my body into feeling awake. And then, chemo bags hanging like grim ornaments in the corner, I would check emails, make calls, and answer questions with a smile I barely felt. My hands shook while typing, My vision blurred after staring at the screen for too long, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop that I remember one night in particular. I had just gotten home from my latest round of treatment. My apartment was quiet. The only sound the hum of the refrigerator. I sat at the edge of my bed, laptop perched on my knees, trying to finish a project that was due the next morning. My arms ached. My head throbbed. And yet, I kept typing, kept clicking, kept pretending. Because if I stopped, even for a second, I felt like the disease would win. And maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was. But I needed control somewhere. Anywhere. Work became my battlefield, my anchor. Every email sent, every meeting attended, every report submitted was a tiny victory. Proof that I was still here, still fighting, still human. There were moments when the exhaustion overwhelmed me, and I'd stare out the window at the rain streaking down the glass. My reflection would blur, and I would think about how unfair it all was. How a body that used to carry me through life now felt like a traitor. I would close my eyes and let the tears fall silently, letting my grief settle like dust around me. And then, just as silently, I would open my laptop again. I still remember the sound of the 4 pump in the treatment room, the quiet beep every few seconds like a ticking clock reminding me of my mortality. And yet, even as my body weakened, my mind refused to give up. I memorized schedules, responded to clients, drafted emails in between naps on the hospital bench. I lived in this surreal balancing act, fighting cancer and maintaining a life that was already demanding, already unforgiving. And through it all, there was a stubborn thread of hope, a whispered mantra I repeated in my head. I am not defined by this disease. I will not let it take everything from me. Some days, that mantra was a lifeline. Other days, it felt like a cruel joke. I think back to those moments now, the times I pushed myself past the point of exhaustion, the nights I stayed up working when my body screamed for rest. At the time, I told myself it was about proving I could do it. But looking back, maybe I was just trying to prove something to the world that didn't even deserve my proof. Maybe I was trying to prove it to myself. And yet, there was a strange kind of pride in it. A quiet satisfaction that despite everything, I showed up. Despite the fatigue, the nausea, the fear, I kept moving forward. Even when my body wanted to give up, I didn't. Because at that point, I didn't know the storm that was coming. I didn't know how cruel life, or some people in it, could be. I just knew that every day I could stand, every day I could work, was a small rebellion. And in that rebellion, I felt alive. That I thought the hardest part was getting through treatment, fighting to show up every day, pretending to be fine. I thought that once I did my part, the rest would fall into place. But life has a way of twisting even the smallest victories into something heavier, something uncertain. It started with small things. A glance from my boss that lingered too long. An offhand comment in a meeting. Nothing concrete, just the faintest suggestion that maybe, somehow, I wasn't doing enough. At first, I brushed it off. I'm overthinking it, I told myself. They're stressed too. They don't understand what I'm going through. But the doubt started to settle in, like dust on an old shelf, creeping into every corner of my mind. That I would catch myself replaying conversations in my head. The way someone had said, "Are you sure you can handle this?" when I volunteered for a new project. The tone was casual, almost polite, but it hit like a knife. My stomach would twist, a mix of anxiety and anger, and I'd bite my tongue. To stop myself from snapping. I started noticing other subtle signs too. Emails that didn't get replied to, calls rescheduled at the last minute, meetings where I felt invisible. And then there were the whispered conversations, the quiet office chatter that would stop when I walked by. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself, but the feeling of being watched, of being judged, started to gnaw at me. That I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I am slacking off without realizing it, I thought. Maybe I'm missing something. And for a while, that question became a constant companion, whispering doubts in the middle of the night. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was failing, not just at work, but at everything. The thing is, I knew what I was putting in. I had proof, if anyone cared to look. The nights I stayed up after chemo, emails sent from a hospital chair, projects completed with trembling hands. Every ounce of energy I had was dedicated to surviving and proving I could keep my life together. But it didn't feel like anyone noticed. Or maybe they noticed, and it simply wasn't enough. There were mornings I would walk into the office and feel a weight pressing down on my chest before I even reached my desk. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the hum of the air conditioning louder, the quiet judgment of others sharper. I started second-guessing myself constantly. Every word I typed, every suggestion I made, every little interaction felt like a test I was failing. And in those moments, a cold realization started to creep in. Some people didn't care what I was going through. Some people didn't care if I fought through chemotherapy just to show up at a desk every day. They only cared about what they could see on the surface, and they saw fatigue, absences, and trembling hands, and judged it as laziness. That I remember one particular morning, looking at my reflection in the office window. My face was pale, eyes ringed with exhaustion, but I was still standing, still trying. And yet, for the first time, I wondered if trying was enough, if it ever would be. The thought was like a cold wind slipping under my skin, chilling me from the inside out. That I caught myself replaying old victories in my head. The praise from colleagues, the acknowledgement for projects completed perfectly, the smiles of genuine appreciation. And I realized, painfully, that those moments felt distant now, like memories from someone else's life. Maybe they were fading because they didn't matter as much as I thought. Maybe nothing I did would ever be enough for certain people. But even as the doubt settled in, there was a part of me that refused to give in completely. A stubborn ember of defiance that whispered, "You know what you've done. You know your effort. Don't let them make you forget." It wasn't much, but it was enough to get me through another day. The tension became a quiet shadow, following me through meetings, emails, and casual hallway conversations. I found myself watching every interaction, reading between every line, analyzing every glance. The effort I had spent fighting cancer suddenly felt like it was under a microscope, weighed and measured by people who couldn't possibly understand. And yet, I couldn't stop caring what they thought. Not entirely. Some nights, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the city outside my window blending with the hum of my own anxiety. Am I imagining this? Or is something really wrong? The line between reality and paranoia blurred, leaving me vulnerable, exhausted, and painfully aware that I was alone in this. And that, I realized, was the cruelest part, the isolation. Not the solitude of being alone with my thoughts, but the loneliness of feeling unseen, misunderstood, and slowly judged. The cancer had attacked my body, yes, but this doubt, this creeping suspicion, was attacking my mind, making me question every choice, every effort, every ounce of myself. It was during one of those endless virtual meetings, the kind that felt like they had no beginning or end, that I first felt it, an unmistakable shift. My boss's voice carried that edge I had been sensing for weeks, a subtle critique hidden behind a veneer of professionalism. I tried to focus, to stay grounded, but every word felt like a small jab, a reminder that I was being watched, judged. "Are you sure you're keeping up with everything?" they asked, casually, almost conversationally. But there was an undertone that made my stomach twist. The words were ordinary, the kind anyone might ask. Yet for me, at that moment, they landed like a hammer. I froze for a second, fingers hovering above the keyboard, blinking at the screen as if staring long enough would make the words disappear. My inner monologue screamed, "I've been doing everything I can. Every single day. How dare they even ask that?" But all I could manage was a quiet, measured reply. "Yes, I've been keeping up. Here's the status update." I remember thinking about the nights I had spent after chemo sessions, sitting at my kitchen table with trembling hands, trying to finish reports, send emails, and meet deadlines. I thought of the exhaustion that clung to me like wet clothing, the nausea that made it hard to breathe, and the fear that maybe my body was giving up before my mind did. And yet, here was someone questioning if I was even trying. After the meeting, I sat back in my chair and let out a slow, shaky breath. My heart was racing. Part of me wanted to explode, to scream, to throw my laptop across the room. Another part, the part that had survived chemo and held on to some fragile sense of dignity, just wanted to disappear. I replayed the meeting in my head again and again, analyzing every word, every tone, every pause. Was I overreacting? Was I being paranoid? I remembered one particular day from a week prior. I had stayed late at the office, head pounding from the treatment, hands still trembling, Yet I had managed to finish a report that my boss had specifically requested. I had left around midnight, dragging myself home, exhausted beyond words, and still felt proud. I thought that effort would speak for itself. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe it never did. And then came the moment I dreaded. That lingering glance, the subtle, almost imperceptible sigh when I presented an update. I caught it from the corner of my eye, a twitch of impatience in a corner of the Zoom frame. And it was like a spotlight on every insecurity I had been trying to bury. They think I'm not trying. They think I'm failing. Even after everything, the doubt that had been simmering in the background now felt like a fire licking at my skin. I started second-guessing everything. Was I being too slow? Too careful? Not assertive enough? Every task I completed felt like it was under scrutiny. Every decision weighed against some invisible standard I could never meet that I tried to shake it off, to remind myself why I had kept working through chemo, why I had refused to let the disease define me. I've survived worse. I've done more than most could imagine. But the creeping suspicion that maybe my boss didn't see that maybe no one saw that, gnawed at me relentlessly. That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at the screen, replaying the meeting over and over. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, cars passing by, distant sirens, the ordinary sounds of life moving on as if nothing had happened. And in that ordinary hum, I felt entirely, devastatingly alone that I thought about reaching out to a colleague for reassurance. But even that felt risky. What if they agreed? What if my fears weren't just paranoia? The office that had once been my place of accomplishment now felt like a minefield. Every interaction a potential misstep, every glance a judgment. And yet, despite the anxiety, despite the growing unease, I kept going. I forced myself to respond to emails, attend meetings, and maintain a semblance of normalcy. Because at that point, giving in wasn't an option. Not when I had already fought so hard to show up every day. Not when the alternative was letting someone else dictate my worth. But the first red flag had been raised. And I knew, deep down, that the storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning to. I remember the day like a punch to the chest I never saw coming. I had logged into the Zoom call, expecting another routine meeting, another polite check-in. I thought maybe I'd finally get a chance to clarify my efforts, show my progress, reassure my boss. But I was wrong. From the moment the call started, there was an unmistakable edge in their voice. I tried to focus, to stay professional, but every word that came out felt loaded. Then, they said it. The words that cut deeper than anything I had imagined. You're putting no effort in. I froze. My mind scrambled, trying to catch the meaning, trying to deny it. No effort? I thought of the hours spent typing reports after chemo, of the nights I spent at my kitchen table with trembling hands, of the projects I had carried single-handedly while my body ached and my hair fell out. No effort. I wanted to laugh, but it would have sounded bitter, and maybe it would have made the moment even more humiliating. So instead, I swallowed the lump in my throat, my stomach churning, my heart hammering against my ribcage. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain, but the words caught in my throat. Because how do you justify the impossible? How do you explain fighting cancer and still showing up, still trying, to someone who refuses to see it? I flashed back to my hospital room, line in my arm, laptop balanced precariously on the side table as I sent an email to meet a deadline. My hands shook, my vision blurred, and my body screamed for rest. And yet I had done it. I had pushed through. And now, here I was, being told it wasn't enough that I tried to speak. I tried to make them understand. I've been working through chemotherapy, I said, my voice tight, almost breaking. I've done everything I could. But they didn't listen. The words slipped past me, replaced by their own interpretation. Every point I made, every proof I tried to present, seemed irrelevant. Their accusation hung in the digital space between us, heavy and suffocating. No effort, no effort, no effort. The repetition in my mind felt like a drumbeat I couldn't escape. That I remember sitting there, staring at the screen, noticing the tiny details I had never paid attention to before, the way the corner of their mouth twitched, the subtle nods that weren't really encouragement, the background of a home office that felt somehow cold, sterile, judgmental. Every little thing reinforced the accusation, making it sting all the more. The wave of anger rolled over me, sharp and bitter. How dare they? How dare they reduce my struggle, my survival, my persistence, to this one cruel phrase? My inner monologue screamed at them, at the injustice, at the world. You don't know. You don't know what I've been through. And then came the hollow, aching sadness. The kind that sinks into your chest and settles there, heavy and relentless. I realized, in that moment, that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a dismissal of my humanity, a refusal to see the person behind the work, the body behind the effort. It felt like betrayal, like being punched when you were already on your knees, that I shut my eyes briefly, willing the words away, willing myself not to cry. But the tears were already there, ready to fall. I thought about everything I had endured, the chemotherapy sessions, the nausea, the hair loss, the nights of exhaustion. And now it felt like none of it mattered. No effort. That I remember staring at the muted Zoom screen, wishing I could disappear, wishing the call would end, wishing somehow that the world would pause and recognize the fight I had been through. But the call continued. The accusation continued. And in that digital box, I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life. Even after the call ended, the words echoed in my mind. I replayed them over and over, analyzing every syllable, every tone, every pause. The sting of betrayal mixed with disbelief, and for the first time, a sharp, cold fear began to creep in. If they see me this way, maybe no one else will see the effort either. It was the moment I realized something had shifted irreversibly. The fight wasn't just against cancer anymore. It was against a world that refused to acknowledge it, a workplace that could dismiss a lifetime of effort with 3 cruel words. And I knew, deep down, that life as I had known it was about to change. That this accusation was not just a comment. It was a turning point. I still remember logging into that Zoom call like I had so many times before, except this time. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. My stomach twisted the moment I saw my boss's face on the screen. There was no warmth, no pretense of small talk, just a cold, clipped tone that made my chest tighten. I had a sinking feeling I already knew what was coming, but I couldn't convince my mind to prepare me. You're no longer part of the team, they said, almost as if it were a casual fact of life, like announcing the weather. No warning, no discussion, just the words that felt like a hammer hitting my chest. I tried to process it, tried to make sense of what I had just heard. My mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. I felt like the floor had dropped beneath me. My hands gripped the edge of the desk, nails digging into the wood, trying to anchor myself to reality. No, this can't be happening. This isn't real. But the screen didn't lie. The Zoom window, the calendar reminder, the muted background of my boss's home office. They were all screaming a reality I wasn't ready to face. I remembered moments from the past few months, small victories that now felt like cruel jokes. Staying late to finish a report despite nausea. Logging in from my hospital bed to answer emails. Fighting through chemo, exhaustion, and fear just to show up, to prove I was still here. And now, it was as if none of it mattered. I tried to speak, to defend myself, but the words tangled in my throat. I've been working through treatment. I've done everything I could. But before I could finish, the call ended, leaving me staring at a frozen screen. The digital void swallowing the finality of it. I sank back in my chair, staring at the laptop as if it might suddenly correct itself, as if the words "no longer part of the team" could vanish with a blink. But they didn't. They remained, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on every fiber of me. Flashbacks hit me all at once. Walking through the office after a long chemo day, hair thinning, eyes puffy, forcing a smile for colleagues. Sitting, alone at night, staring at emails, fighting to meet deadlines when my body screamed for rest. Every ounce of effort, every shred of energy, and now it was meaningless. Meaningless. The numbness came first, like a fog rolling in, dulling everything. Except the ache in my chest. I couldn't cry, couldn't scream, couldn't even move. My apartment felt suddenly too small, too silent, too empty. The city hummed outside my window, cars rushing by, people living their lives as if mine didn't exist. And maybe it didn't. Maybe none of it mattered. I kept thinking about the injustice of it, how life had already taken so much from me, and now, here was another blow I didn't deserve. Anger surged, sharp and bitter, but it was tangled with heartbreak, a combination so confusing it left me feeling hollow. How could someone dismiss all that I had done, all I had fought through, with such cold detachment? I remember staring at my hands, trembling slightly, thinking about how much they had endured, how much they had accomplished despite everything. And yet, the job I had poured my energy into, the place I had tried so hard to prove myself in, it didn't care. They didn't see me. They didn't care to see me. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the laptop, staring at the empty chat window, letting the words sink in. It felt like the world had tilted on its axis, like gravity had shifted and I was floating somewhere, between disbelief and despair. And yet, somewhere deep inside, beneath the numbness, beneath the anger, there was a small, stubborn spark. I survived cancer. I've fought through unimaginable exhaustion. I will survive this too. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And in that moment of devastation, that tiny ember of defiance was all I had to hold on to. The first few days after I was fired felt like I was floating in a haze, untethered from the world I thought I knew. My apartment, once a safe space, suddenly felt suffocating. Every object, every corner, seemed to whisper reminders of what had just happened. My laptop sitting on the desk, emails left unanswered, my calendar still filled with deadlines I would never meet, the coffee cup I'd abandoned mid-sip during my Zoom call. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, mechanically performing small tasks, watering a plant, rinsing a dish, changing the laundry, but none of it brought any comfort. Each action was just motion, a hollow echo of the life I had once controlled. My thoughts were a constant loop of replaying that call, hearing the words "no effort" over and over, as if some cruel voice had implanted them directly into my skull. Anger bubbled under the surface, raw and bitter. How could someone dismiss everything I'd endured, everything I'd done, with such cold detachment? How could they see me as lazy, as someone failing, when I had literally fought to survive? The injustice of it was almost unbearable. I wanted to scream, to throw something across the room, to demand recognition for my struggle, but my energy, what little remained, was spent just existing, and then came the grief. The hollow, aching grief that didn't have a clear shape or reason, but wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I mourned not just the job, but the loss of my sense of worth, the betrayal of a place I had once trusted. I remembered the pride I had felt before chemo, the small victories, the recognition, the laughter with colleagues. And now, all of it seemed distant, almost unreal that I found myself checking my phone compulsively, as if maybe, just maybe, a message would appear that would undo everything. An apology, a clarification, a lifeline. But there was nothing. Silence. The digital world, which had once been full of notifications and affirmations, now reflected only my isolation. Sleep offered no relief. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, mind racing. I replayed every interaction from the past weeks, trying to pinpoint where things had gone wrong. Had I missed a signal? Misinterpreted a tone? Could I have done more? Every thought was a needle, stitching doubt into the fabric of my mind. Flashbacks haunted me. The late nights at the kitchen table after chemo, typing reports with trembling hands, sitting in the hospital chair, for dripping steadily, answering emails between bouts of nausea, walking into the office, hair thinning, eyes puffy, trying to smile through exhaustion. All of it felt meaningless now. All of it had been invisible that I started to withdraw. Friends called, asking how I was, and I tried to answer, but words felt heavy and inadequate. How do you explain that you've survived cancer only to be told you were failing at life? How do you explain the mixture of heartbreak, anger, and disbelief that no one else seems to recognize? Food lost its appeal. The world's colors seemed muted, and even small joys, like the sunlight on my balcony or the distant hum of the city, felt distant. I wandered through the apartment, restless, unable to anchor myself in the life that had once felt familiar. And yet, amidst the despair, there were moments of quiet reflection. Moments when I would catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror, tired, hollow-eyed, but still here. And I realized that even though the world had rejected me, even though my boss had dismissed every ounce of effort I'd made, I had survived something far bigger than a job. There was a fragile, stubborn thread running through the darkness, a reminder that I had fought, that I had endured, that I had shown up when my body and mind screamed for rest. And while I couldn't yet see the path forward, I knew that acknowledging my own resilience was the first step toward reclaiming some sense of control. That it took a few days, maybe a week, before I let anyone in. Not because I didn't want support, I craved it, but because I was afraid of how fragile I felt. Afraid of exposing the rawness, the emptiness, the anger. Afraid that someone would dismiss me, like my boss had. And then I reached out. Slowly, tentatively. A text to a friend. Can we talk? A call to a family member. I just need someone to listen. And when the voices came back, warm, familiar, human, it was like a lifeline had been thrown into the darkness I'd been drifting through. I started talking, really talking, for the first time since the firing. About chemo, about the exhaustion, about the way it felt to be dismissed when I had already given everything. The words poured out in messy, jagged sentences, punctuated by sobs and long pauses. But I wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in days, I felt seen. There were moments that surprised me, quiet moments of connection. A friend sending a message, just to check in, a sibling offering to bring me coffee, someone listening to my story without judgment. And in those moments, I started to remember something I had forgotten, that my worth isn't defined by a Zoom call or a boss's opinion, or even a job. My worth is built on survival, on courage, on showing up every single day, even when life tries to knock me down. I reflected a lot during those quiet afternoons, sitting on the balcony with the city stretching below me, the sunlight catching dust in the air. I thought about the journey I'd been on, from diagnosis to treatment, from fighting to surviving, from hope to heartbreak, and I realized something profound. I had been seeing myself through someone else's lens for too long. I had allowed a workplace, a person, to define my value. And now I understood that I needed to reclaim it for myself. Flashbacks emerged, but not like the haunting ones before. These were softer, warmer, the small victories I had accomplished. At work, the praise I had received from colleagues who truly saw my effort, the moments I had felt proud despite the fatigue and fear. I allowed myself to revisit them, to acknowledge them, to own them. That I journaled for the first time in years, writing down thoughts I hadn't dared speak aloud. I wrote about fear, anger, pain, but also resilience, determination, and hope. I wrote about my body, which had endured so much, and about my mind, which refused to break entirely. It felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been stolen, piece by piece, during those weeks of isolation and judgment. Support came in many forms: calls, messages, even quiet understanding from someone just sitting with me in silence. And in that support, I started to see myself more clearly. I wasn't just a worker, a colleague, or an employee. I was a survivor. I was someone who had faced the impossible and endured. And that, I realized, was worth more than any job title, more than any praise, more than anyone else's judgment. There were still moments of doubt, of course. Old insecurities crept back when I checked emails or saw notifications from former colleagues. But now, I had something stronger to counter them: perspective. I had experienced what it meant to fight and survive, to persevere through pain and still show up for myself. And that perspective became my shield, my compass, guiding me through the fog of anger and grief. That I began to plan, tentatively at first. Small steps: updating my resume, reconnecting with supportive contacts, even exploring opportunities that felt aligned with who I was becoming. But more importantly, I started to plan emotionally. I allowed myself to grieve fully, to feel the heartbreak, and then, slowly, to rise above it. I realized that survival wasn't just about enduring treatment. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my voice. And in those reflective moments, I found something I hadn't felt in weeks: a fragile, fierce sense of hope. Not blind hope, not the naive belief that everything would be perfect, but the deeper, steadier understanding that I was still here. I was still breathing. I was still capable of moving forward. It wasn't an instant shift. Reclaiming control over my life felt more like learning to walk again after being knocked down, fumbling at first, then gradually finding my balance. The days after leaning on support were still tinged with exhaustion and doubt, but somewhere beneath that, a quiet determination began to grow. I started with small routines, things I could control. Mornings became mine again. I would make coffee, feeling its warmth seep into my hands, listen to music that made my chest feel full, and breathe deliberately. No meetings, no deadlines. No expectations, just me. I realized that control wasn't about conquering the world immediately. It was about taking back the small things, the pieces of life that were mine and mine alone. Then came the work. Not the emails, the deadlines, the Zoom calls that had once suffocated me, but real work, the kind that mattered to me. I updated my resume, but not like a chore. I treated it like a declaration. I have survived. I am capable. I will rise again. I reached out to former colleagues who had been supportive, reconnecting with people who had truly seen my effort, and began exploring opportunities that felt aligned with my values, my health, and my sense of self. There were moments of hesitation. I'd catch myself replaying that Zoom call, my boss's words, no effort, and a cold wave of anger would wash over me. But this time, I didn't let it settle in. Instead, I breathed through it, reminded myself of the truth. I had done everything, more than most could imagine. The judgment of one person didn't define me. Their failure to see my effort didn't erase my courage. Flashbacks shifted, too, from haunting to empowering. I remembered nights at the kitchen table, trembling but typing, afternoons in the hospital chair, sending emails between chemo sessions, the very act of showing up when my body begged me to stay still. And suddenly, those memories weren't just proof, they were my armor. Every ounce of struggle became a badge of resilience, a reminder that I had already endured more than many could comprehend, that I started to say no more often, to commitments that drained me, to toxic interactions that chipped at my confidence, to anything that threatened my mental and emotional health. Saying no felt revolutionary. Each refusal, each boundary I set, reinforced my agency, my right to protect myself and my energy. I realized that control isn't always about doing more. It's often about choosing what not to do, what not to let in, and what to prioritize. Even my health became a domain I reclaimed. I scheduled checkups. I nurtured my body with better meals, movement, and rest. The hospital visits were no longer just about fighting cancer. They were about reclaiming ownership of my body, celebrating its strength, and acknowledging its fragility without shame. There were days I felt weak, days when doubt crept in like an unwelcome visitor. But instead of letting it dominate, I observed it, acknowledged it, and let it pass. The difference was subtle but profound. I wasn't running from the fear anymore. I wasn't shrinking from the past. I was facing it, holding it, and choosing how much power it had over me. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, confidence returned. Not the loud, flashy confidence of someone who needs to prove themselves to the world, but the quiet, steady certainty that I could navigate life on my own terms. I was still healing, still adjusting, still fragile at times, but I was no longer lost in the shadow of someone else's judgment. Looking back, I realized that control had never really been about work or approval. It had always been about my right to define myself, to honor my effort, to recognize my own resilience, and to reclaim my life from the people and circumstances that tried to diminish it. And in that reclamation, I found a kind of freedom I hadn't felt in months, a freedom to live on my terms, to breathe without permission, to stand in my own truth, and to acknowledge, finally, that surviving cancer wasn't just about the disease. It was about surviving the world's cruelty, too, and coming out stronger on the other side. Closure didn't arrive like a sudden thunderclap. It was quieter, subtler, a soft dawn after months of darkness. I didn't wake up one day feeling completely healed, completely free. Instead, it came in moments, small, ordinary moments that quietly stitched my broken edges back together. I remember sitting on my balcony one evening, the city lights shimmering below me, a soft breeze brushing against my skin. I thought about the journey I'd been on, the shock of diagnosis, the grueling months of treatment, the subtle doubts, the betrayal, the firing, and the long, heavy aftermath. And somewhere in that reflection, I realized I wasn't broken. I had been forged by pain, yes, but also by resilience, by courage, by the relentless determination to keep showing up, even when the world told me it wasn't enough. The wounds were still there. I could feel the scars beneath my skin and in my mind. But I had learned something vital. Scars don't just mark what's been taken from us. They remind us of what we've survived, of the strength we carry forward. I thought about the people who had supported me, the friends who called late at night, the family who listened without judgment, the colleagues who truly saw my effort. I realized closure wasn't about erasing the past or forgiving the unfairness immediately. It was about acknowledging the support, the victories, the truths that sustained me. It was about owning my story without letting anyone else write its meaning. Flashbacks softened in tone now, reframed not as trauma, but as proof of endurance. The nights in the hospital, the trembling hands typing emails, the exhausted walks home. All of it became a testament to my perseverance. Even the firing, the accusation, the disbelief, they became chapters in a story of survival, not shame that I allowed myself to feel the emotions fully. The anger, the grief, the heartbreak, they were valid, they were real, and I gave them space, without letting them define me. And then, gradually, the emptiness began to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of empowerment, a calm certainty that I could continue forward without needing validation from those who had failed to see me that I started. Envisioning a future that wasn't dictated by fear or judgment. A future where I chose the work I did, the people I surrounded myself with, the ways I honored my body and my mind. A life guided by my own standards, my own values, and my own pace. A life where effort was measured by my heart and my courage, not by someone else's narrow view. Closure came, too, in the simple act of forgiveness, not for them, not for the unfair firing, not for the dismissal of my struggle, but for myself. Forgiveness for doubting my own worth, for letting their words echo in my mind for so long, for forgetting, even briefly, that I had survived more than most could imagine. That I remember taking a deep breath, the kind that expands your chest and somehow lifts a weight you didn't know you were carrying. The city hummed softly below, and I felt a strange, gentle gratitude for the hardships that taught me resilience, for the moments of despair that revealed my strength, and for the quiet, unwavering truth that I am enough. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I realized something I hadn't dared admit in months. I am more than a job, more than someone else's judgment, more than the pain I endured. I am a survivor. I am resilient. I am whole, even with the scars. Closure wasn't a neat bow at the end of a story. It was messy, imperfect, and beautifully human. It was learning to breathe, to trust myself, to honor my journey, and to walk forward carrying both the lessons and the strength of everything I had endured. And as I did for the first time in a long while, I felt a deep, abiding peace.